Welcome to a procurement podcast, The Reform Rundown, with your hosts Chris Robinson and Fleur Summers.
Over the course of this series, Fleur and I will be discussing some of the main themes and concepts surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 and what it will mean to the public sector ahead of launch. Fleur and I have a combined 40 years public sector procurement experience and will be using some of that experience to share our knowledge and insights around the Act itself.
So let's get into today's topic. Welcome everyone to episode 5 of a procurement podcast, The Reform Rundown. Today we have a very special episode where we are joined by a guest speaker. Some of you who have been following the journey of the Procurement Act on LinkedIn will have seen a range of insightful and fact-sharing articles, videos and general opinion pieces.
So without further ado, welcome to Kieran McGaughey to our podcast episode. For our listeners, do you want to give a quick overview as to your background and how you have landed into the world of procurement?
Yes, thanks very much, Chris and Fleur, and thanks very much for the invite to take part. I think you've quickly established yourselves as a sort of Ant and Dec of the public procurement world on LinkedIn, so it's a pleasure to be here. You've opened the floodgates now with having guests on, I'm afraid, though, so you're going to be tortured. But as I say, my name is Kieran McGaughey. I am a consultant solicitor specialising in public procurement law. In terms of my career to date, for most of the past 10 years, I've worked in local government. Before that, I worked for a number of law firms, both in England and, as you might guess from my accent, in Northern Ireland. Fell into procurement really by accident, as many people do. One of my colleagues was actually retiring, and I was coming to the stage of qualifying as a solicitor, and he pulled me aside and asked me would I be interested in qualifying into public procurement. And the reason that he had for that always makes me laugh, because he said sometimes you have to say no to people, and I think you could do that in a nice way. And I thought, well, I'll take that as a compliment for my diplomacy skills. But no, look, that was one of the best things that's ever happened to me career-wise. It's been a really interesting journey since then, working with a number of councils and combined authorities, mainly up here in the north and northeast of England. And as of last year, I've also been delivering a lot of training as a sort of side hustle, in particular on the Public Procurement Act. And as you say, very active on LinkedIn and social media, which has been really interesting, and had lots of really kind and positive engagement on that. So that's all been good.
Excellent, thank you. So welcome to our podcast. So just as a bit of overview as to where we are now, it's been a bit like a month, hasn't it? Since I can't believe it either, since our last podcast episode. And in that time, of course, there have been some significant updates in the world of the Procurement Act. So I think we'll just have a quick chat and overview as to where we are at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think probably first and foremost, the ideal place to start is back on the 22nd of April, when we finally received an announcement from the Cabinet Office advising that as part of the wider transforming public procurement approach, they're working towards and that's the key thing, working towards a go live date for the new procurement regime, and that date being the 28th of October of this year. So again, whilst this date is still to be formalised in the commencement regulations themselves, this certainly shows a significant step in moving towards the implementation of, as we know, and as we've said on previous podcasts as well, the biggest change that the public sector will see from a procurement perspective for many, many years.
It's what we've all been waiting for, hasn't it? That actual times the announcement about go live. So this announcement also marks the beginning of a 6-month preparation period that has previously been referred to, and starts the lead-in time, which will require a significant amount of work by contracting authorities in terms of getting ready and prepared for this go live date. We've also started to see a staggered release of guidance documents and notes, which more are expected to be shared with us over the course of the next few months, all in readiness for the go live date.
During this time, we've also seen the publication of what now is known as the Procurement Regulations 2024, also referred to as secondary legislation, of course, which provide us with more details and insight as to the areas that will need to be included in the notices, for example. These are also subject to approval through the House of Lords and House of Commons, of course, before coming into effect. Almost to reiterate the point that you've just made there, Fleur, whilst the sector will no doubt be comforted by the fact that the guidance is now being issued. What will also be of concern is the sheer volume of amount of detail they'll evidently have to digest and take appropriate measures in order to ultimately be business ready ahead of implementation.
It's like the launch of a lot of work now, isn't it? That's 6 months. So this leads us nicely onto the areas that we will be discussing today in terms of potential areas that public sector bodies need to start considering during the implementation period and beyond. But before we get into that, we just want to give a quick reminder or shout out to check out our latest blog post that we've recently published. These can be found on our new LinkedIn group, the link to which will be in the description for this podcast. So please feel free to join the group and get involved in our discussions focusing on all things Procurement Act related.
Kieran, we've got quite a few things to discuss with you. On today's recording.
Is it too late to say no?
Yeah, well, as I say, there's quite a lot here for us to,
and they
to,
just
to
came
run
from
through.
a conversation that we had a few weeks ago.
Indeed, yeah, and I think actually also is in part the fact that the month or so that we've had since our last podcast release, and typically, we've gone around about a month, and we've been bombarded with updates to cover today. So we're going to tackle these in no particular order, but by the same token, I would suggest that they're all of equal value to one another. I think actually, Kieran, what would be really useful is perhaps maybe all of us to kind of sit in the pocket with regards to us purely as many organisations, whether they be legal firms or actually public procuring organisations, sitting in the pocket with regards to speculating from what we were going to see really from now till October, this proposed targeted go live date of the 28th of October. So if we just do that for a moment or two, Kieran, over to you. I mean, I think what we're going to be seeing in relation to that between this period.
Yes, it's a great question, Chris, and I think there will be, particularly as we get closer to October, there'll be a little bit of nervousness. I don't think councils will be running out, or other public authorities are going to be rushing out big tickets procurements in September. I do think they are going to be thinking very carefully. Are we going to publish now? Are we going to wait and have that governed by the new regimes? Because obviously there can be consequences. So even, for example, you set up a framework in under the new rules, so say between now and October, but in 2, 3, 4 years time, perhaps, when you're using that framework, you're still caught by the current rules, and that could potentially create some confusion. So I think that's going to be one of the really interesting bits, Chris, is as we get closer to the time, are people going to wait and see and do it under the new rules, or try and rely on the certainty of the existing rules? And I think that's really a case by case consideration for authorities about pros and cons of each.
No, definitely. I think also as well that the other thing that's worth being mindful of, as I'm sure the public sector procuring bodies themselves will be, is by hook or by crook during the course of 2024, there is going to be a general election as well, which of course then the implication of which is purdah, which in many instances will drive to a halt or certainly pause public procurement activity as well in some regards. So I think again that's something that the sector will no doubt be mindful of, plus the fact that they've got to get themselves business ready for the launch of the new Act come October of this year. So I suppose the other thing to consider in that regard is how the sector will be ready for that launch, considering the roles and responsibilities within procurement and other supporting functions and departments that are involved on the day-to-day in terms of procurement activity. So if we move on from there.
Okay, so the next topic that we're going to talk about is contract register and the forward procurement plan. So as we've seen, Kieran, this is like a massive area, isn't it, in terms of the Procurement Act and what's coming out, and one that I think a lot of public sector bodies are going to be starting to have to start looking at, like in terms of what their pipeline is, their contracts register, those type of things. It's going to be a key area of them, isn't it?
Absolutely, Fleur, couldn't agree more. And the thing is to bear in mind with this, there's nothing to stop authorities doing this today.
No, exactly.
It is good. It is good practice. And it's probably something in my experience is fairly sketchy. One thing I just want to touch upon, I think is interesting, hopefully for listeners, is it's that earlier point we talk about. over the next few years, it's going to be a bit of a mix and match as to what rules apply. So again, given that example of a framework agreement that was set up today, but you're using it in 2026, 2027. I heard a great idea, and I must admit it wasn't my idea. I have stolen it from someone else, but they were saying to afford your contracts, I'd love to claim the credit, but to afford your contracts some sort of reference number, which makes it easy to determine which regime it's subject to. And that will save you a world of pain in a few years' time when someone comes to you and says, hi, Chris, hi, Fleur, we'd like to modify this contract, or we'd like to call off this framework. At least that way So take, for example, a modification. That way you're going to know, right, we're looking at Regulation 72 PCR, or we're looking at the new rules in the Procurement Act and what can be what modifications are allowed there. So I think those are the kind of little practical tips which people can just start to hopefully look at over the coming months.
I like that idea, and I think that could be really quite simple, couldn't it? Almost just like add in a single, like a letter, or come up with a letter or their own legend or key, or whatever, however they want to do it, in terms of just adding it on to the end of a project reference, and then you have something different for under the new regs, and then you'll easily be able to see which ones it goes by, because we all know what's happening. People change, people move on, and a few years down the line they'll be like, which regulations is this under, that type of thing. So that's I really like that idea. But the transition period is definitely something that is key, and how that's going to work, I think that needs a lot more understanding.
It comes with a challenge, doesn't it, that? And I think a given, and you will know yourself, Kieran, speaking to organisations within the sector as well, is they're going to have to balance this with, in many instances, a limitation of resources and capacity to support it from a procurement perspective. So it's getting to grips with the implications of the Act and being able to suitably resource it to make sure, again, as we've reiterated already, the fact that they need to get business ready ahead of launch. So this transitional period that we talk about is going to be an interesting and challenging time for the sector, I think. Yeah, definitely. And also, just a point on the forward procurement plans themselves, Kieran. Then now, of course, that we know that it's mandated in terms of the fact that public procuring bodies are going to have to publish these and make them visible for procuring organisations and prospective suppliers alike. Do you foresee any obvious benefits for either or the public procuring bodies and prospective suppliers having the ability to have that foresight of forthcoming procurements?
I think so, Chris. I think it's a good idea, and I see it as part of a range of, in particular, supplier-friendly measures that we see in the new regime, like the new enhanced focus on prompt payment. You have to publish, the payment compliant notice. There are also the new focus towards greater pre-market engagement. There's also going to be the single digital platform, and hopefully a Telos One system. So I think the pipeline needs to be viewed in that wider context of being part of a raft of hopefully pro-supplier changes. But I think it's also just good for the authority to take stock and think, what have we got coming up over the next few years? Again, how are we going to resource that? What's coming up at the same time? And that applies on the other side of the fence. And, yourselves will know, working with people on both sides, is bidders can also resource if they know a particular contract is coming up round about the same time with two of their different client authorities in it. They can plan accordingly. So I think the pipeline notice is really good. And I think the important point legally is you're not held to it. So there isn't, I don't see it as entailing much risk for authorities. It is just indicative. So I welcome that new measure.
It also helps suppliers, don't they? They can then plan for what's coming up, so they can also identify, okay, I want to aim for that one. I can see that procurement is on their pipeline in X months, or however far ahead it is, and they can be like, that's what we're going to aim for. We want to focus on this. So it gives suppliers that much more transparent information as to what the authorities are planning to do.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about the fact that, you know, the three of us have worked directly within the sector, you know, whether it be currently or previously for many, many years. You know, it's a given that the sector themselves, they do like a good template, don't they? And I think any kind of like templates, whether it be by way of contract registers, of course, we're beginning to see in the guidance notes in relation to the contract notices themselves, but also the forward procurement plans themselves, you know, if there's the opportunity to adopt a standardized approach around that, you know, not only will it help suppliers in terms of trawling through the various forward procurement plans, but also be of assistance to the public procuring organisations in terms of, well, this is the format, this is the content that needs to be published within these plans. It's got that consistent approach throughout, hasn't it?
Wouldn't it be great though, wouldn't it, if all the pipelines across all of the public sector bodies are the same? Everyone could, you know, you could know what you're looking for across everything.
Definitely. I think, you know, there's I certainly, you know, have a degree of sympathy for suppliers, and we're going to talk about SMEs today as well, and the increased drive towards supporting SMEs and encouragement for them to participate in public procuring opportunities themselves. But you know, you think about it from a supplier's perspective, they have a plethora of e-procurement platforms that they have to register to get sight and access to these documents. So I think, you know, again, the forward procurement plans and having those available and the foresight, to the point that you've mentioned already, Fleur, to look in advance and identify which opportunities they want to pursue, will certainly assist them.
No, definitely.
Excellent. So I think one of the other things we want to cover today, Kieran, is around spend identification, and I think it ties in quite nicely with what we've just discussed just now. I think, again, you know, in readiness for the launch of the Act, go live of the Act itself, I think provides a perfect opportunity for public bodies to actually vet their financial systems that they've got, whichever platform they use, identify any areas in which they have significant spend, which would mandate that they would need to undertake a competitive, transparent procurement exercise. And whilst they're undertaking all these activities in terms of getting ready for launch, I think it is, again, and I reiterate, an opportunity for them to carry out that spend identification exercise.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about you, Kieran, but obviously there's other things than just procurement, isn't there? So like you mentioned just now, the payment compliance notice, that's probably more of a finance, like getting the information from the finance side in the authority. So there's got to be a lot of joined up working between procurement, finance and other areas to be able to meet some of these requirements.
Absolutely, Fleur, and I very much see it as a team effort. You know, that this is going to impact all sorts of different teams. And, you know, Chris's point about spend identification is a great idea. And, you know, again, both for the Procurement Act, but also just generally, you know, where's your organisation spending money? Do people understand the procurement rules, and particularly rules which will change slightly, but around things like aggregation? You know, are people inadvertently, or, you know, are people awarding contracts that they think are below threshold but actually contain extension options? Or, you know, say, for example, a software agreement that automatically rolls over. Well, once it rolls over, does it end up being above threshold? You know, and that will change under the new rules. Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of coming back on the point around payments, so yes, you need to involve your finance teams, legal, obviously. I would say that procurement. Your avoid legal is usually the best approach. Nah, just kidding. And also then, like, your commercial teams, you know, your contract managers, they're going to really play a key role under this new regime. So, you know, authorities do increasingly need to be thinking not just of that initial get the contract procured and, you know, put it in a dusty drawer somewhere, but think, how are we going to effectively manage this contract for the next 2 years, 3 years, you know, whatever it may be. So absolutely involve the right people from the outset would be my advice.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think whilst we're on the topic of like other areas that they need, or other areas of authority that they need to like be aware of, some things that in their gift, maybe not necessarily their gift, but you know, their own documentation. So I think we talked about this previously, Kieran, didn't we, when we had our initial chat? But things like their standing orders, their internal procurement policy procedures, their procurement strategies for the team, those type of things, they all need to be reviewed, updated to align to like new terminology. How are they going to do things like, I don't know, the competitive flexible procedure? What's going to be their approach on that type of thing? It touches a lot more than just how you're actually going to procure things, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, Fleur. And I think, authorities do need to be aware that, aside from the Cabinet Office training and your 10 1-hour modules and your 3-day deep dive, like there's a lot of things you do just need to sort out yourself. And unfortunately,
getting your own house ready or something like that, isn't it? Something
you do, get it tidied up for visitors. There is a lot that needs to be done, and really there isn't an awful lot of time, Fleur. And like you raised a great point there around updating, your constitution or your contract standing orders. But these things, depending on the council, it may need to go to full council, it may need to go to a particular committee.
So you're going to need to start planning that in, knowing the dates as to when that's going to be done, and and then working backwards almost, isn't it? So I got to get it done by then. When can I get it approved? And but just I guess it's just also identifying what it is they need to be updating.
Absolutely. And you've touched upon one of the key ones there, but I think for me, and anyone who suffers me on LinkedIn will know, is like the invitation to tender is a really important document as well. And I think in particular, you mentioned earlier, the new competitive flexible procedure, but the fact is, like, if you're a contracting authority today, your ITT won't be fit for purpose for a competitive flexible procedure. That's a fact. So you are going to have to think, if we're running a multi-stage process and during that, we want to, refine the award criteria, that all needs to be set out in your initial, I would say it'd be helpful to have it in the ITT. If it's a multi-stage process, how's each stage going to be work? How long is it going to last? How's it going to be scored? Are certain bidders going to be eliminated? If we're now introducing things like site visits or dialogue negotiations, what are the parameters of that? Because we don't have the duty of transparency, but we've got this new obligation that we must have regard to the importance of sharing information. So it does, for me, still need to all be set out very clearly. What's going to happen? When's it going to happen? Who's going to be involved? Because otherwise that just, the legal risk will just multiply.
And it's almost like I need to start thinking that now, isn't it? And it's all based on the risk of the authority and what they see and how they do it. And start bottoming out those decisions. How do we want to see competitive, flexible procedures being run? That type of thing. But I think that's a massive area that they need to start looking at, like you say, Chris, instead of just like the training.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just going back to the point that's been mentioned around standing orders and the internal procurement procedures themselves. Now, of course, we have the Act, we have the regulations, we have the mandatory generic training, if you will, the 10 hours training and the various deeper dives that are going to follow from that, which, it's a given that procurement professionals within the sector will get to grips with, attend, participate, etc. But of course, you guys have just touched on already a number of different functions and departments within the sector that engage with procurement as part of that overarching public procurement exercise itself. Now, going back to the point around standing orders and internal procurement procedures, those are the functions and departments I would suggest, I would bet, and I think it'd be a safe bet, will not read the Act. They will not read the regulations. Therefore, it is vitally important that those standing orders and procurement procedures are updated and mirror and comply with what is stipulated, albeit in a local form, from an internal perspective, what is detailed within both the Acts and the subsequent regulations themselves. And I think probably the better way to describe it is that will be a snapshot of what needs to be followed in order to remain compliant. Will be useful for other functions outside of the procurement team.
And I guess, Kieran, once they've sort of made those decisions, that then flows down into like their processes and all those type of things as to how they might run an open process or those type of things. It's almost like they need to get that to then start bottoming out the rest of it. So yeah, I think that's a lot of work, don't you?
it's a huge amount of work for, and we have to remember also, I know we discussed the other day, but you have holidays and stuff coming up as well, and that it's not even 6 months anymore, but that will very quickly become 3 months, 4 months, and there's a heck of a lot to do, and we've only really touched the surface of that today. There's going to be other things, so not to scare people, but Chris made a very important point about resources. But if something is a lot of work, then the best way is to break that down into segments, because if authorities sit on this, then come September they're going to have a huge amount of work to cram in over September and October to get ready for the 28th. So start today would be my recommendation.
Definitely.
Going back, as far back as January 2021, I believe it was, and we were seeing the various papers that were coming out, and the consultation exercises that followed during that process that's got us to where we are today. One thing stood out for me in particular was that with what is now UK-centric regulations is the increased drive towards making public procurement opportunities available to SMEs. And I think all of us can agree that that is a positive step and a positive change, and hopefully something that the sector themselves will embrace. But within your respective network, Kieran, the contacts that you've been speaking to, what have been the attitudes from the sector around this clear push towards supporting SMEs?
Yeah, look, I think it is something, Chris, people are generally keen to support. I think just one of the things that's slightly confusion is this is one of the new have regard duties in the Act. So it's not absolutely you must do this, it's you must have regard to it. And also, in terms of the new procurement objectives, like value for money or sharing information, you must have regard to the importance of them. So I think there's just at times a little bit of confusion around what that means, because, and also, some of the training material and the guidance suggests that these are things you absolutely must do, but you'll appreciate to have regard to something doesn't always necessarily mean you must do it. So that's just exactly. And I think one of the best ways I would suggest for authorities to deal with these have regard duties is to look at having some sort of checklist as part of your internal process.
I was just going to say that.
Do like a good checklist, a good topic, as you said, Fleur. And taking on board, Chris's point about the new focus on this. Well, you could in theory have a checklist of, to have regard to the SME barriers and how you might be able to remove them, value for money, things like that could all be documented, because ultimately in the event of a legal challenge, that's going to be what helps you demonstrate that you have had regard. Because if you say, yep, we've had regard to all of that, and they say, right, what evidence have you got of that? And, we're all looking at each other thinking, did nobody write this down?
And I guess, Kieran, that's the other way, isn't it? Because if they have regard and have consideration and have those discussions as to whether for SMEs and stuff like that, if it's not appropriate, then they need to be doing the justification as to why, so that they can always come back to that as to, we've considered it, we talked about this at XYZ, but we decided this.
Yeah. Do you think actually from a best practice perspective, and previously when we were discussing standing orders and internal procurement procedures in general, this is something, as Kieran's mentioned, it's on a checklist, and by way of a justification, as we know, having worked directly, myself and you, Fleur, working directly within the sector previously, that there's a necessity to have almost different terminology used, but ultimately for the same approach, but an approval to procure to kick off that. Now, again, by way of best practice, whether or not it's worth them actually having a statement within a document such as that to say, have you, again, picking up your point there, have regards with regards to picking up SMEs and encouraging them to support and participate in this procurement exercise. If not, what's the justification around that?
Exactly.
So again, so another potential best practice approach around that, I suggest.
I think linking in or moving on to the next area, which links in quite well, is social value. So similar to SME support and stuff like that, obviously there's going to be more emphasis around being able to consider social value. But again, Kieran, that could be something quite easily could be part of a checklist in terms of considering social value, how it could be incorporated into your requirement and those type of things.
Absolutely, Fleur. We do have this move, as you will know, from most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. But a lot of organisations are already doing social value and doing it well in many cases. So this isn't necessary. I don't see this necessarily legally as being a sea change, but what I do think is important is that it sends a message, to commissioners and procurement people that absolutely you can be thinking about, quality, sustainability, social value. My concern with this is just around, like, we do see on the news occasionally, that the budgetary position that certain, particularly local authorities, find themselves in. So, look, it would be absolutely great to start throwing around 20%, 30% weightings for social value. Wow. But, speaking to those finance people that we were talking to earlier in terms of the 30 days payment, they may well have something to say about that, those who control the purse strings. So, yeah, look, I think it's going to remain a difficult, delicate balance, getting the right price, quality, social value mix for any given procurement.
And that's going to be specific to each requirement. So each requirement or contract procurement needs to be considered in its own right, doesn't it? So that it's not going to be the same, like, social value percentage that could be given to this one that's given to that one, because it can be totally different. So yeah, I think we'll see a good mix of it. But also it sends, like, this change from meat to mat. It gives a good signal to the suppliers that we want you to look into these and consider these social value elements as well. It's not just about price and the quality response. We want you to be, like, doing this type of area.
Definitely. The social value, I'm going to quickly jump on my soapbox and quickly jump off. But what I am going to say here is, just by way of a scenario, I think, it'd be a bold statement if a public procuring body said, right, okay, going forward, every procurement exercise we administer is going to have 20-30% weighting applied to social value, just for argument's sake. And what concerns me with regards to that, and actually throwing out figures around that by way of evaluation criteria, is it does dilute, I would suggest, everything else, and ultimately what is fundamentally important to the acquisition of that particular procurement exercise. That's the intention behind that. And finally on that, I actually think, whilst it is very important, I think it would be a very sad day for public procurement if a contract ended up, the determining factor of a public contract being awarded on the basis of social value. And from your legal perspective, Kieran, I do wonder and ponder how well you could actually defend an outcome from a procurement exercise if it was in fact the determining factor being social value.
Yeah, I think this all goes back to, Chris, the earlier point about, setting out very clearly in your invitation to tender and your initial documents how you're going to score it, because we do benefit in procurement law from that 30-day time limit, general time limit, but rarely seems to be extended. So if, for example, you published a procurement and you did have a very high social value weighting, someone would need to complain sooner rather than later. In practice, Chris, I think they probably wouldn't. I think the people who would be complaining are those internal finance managers that you mentioned earlier, who would be saying, yeah, this all sounds great, but we're not doing it. So it is going to remain a difficult area, and it is complex. I think it's, to be honest, I think it's overly complex because we still have the Public Services Social Value Act.
We do, yeah.
The Procurement Act doesn't itself really reference social value, but it's captured in the guidance around public benefits. I think that's just a bit confusing, Chris and Fleur, from my perspective, in terms of, could it have just said social value, or no, could we have mentioned social value in there somewhere? Because I don't like, and getting back to Chris's point earlier about, having things that for people who aren't going to read the regs, but for those who do read the regs, I don't like the fact they have to go shopping around to guidance and secondary regs to get the answer. I really quite keen that the law is applicable by those who are on the front line at the coalface applying the law. So it is, I think social value generally will come off better out of the Procurement Act, but it's still, for me, more complicated than it needs to be. And hopefully at some point in the future that might be tidied up further. But as I say, certainly, certainly isn't going to be any reduced ability to take account of social value.
Yeah, and I suppose just one final point on social value, to aid in the careful selection of weighting and approach based on the procurement subject matter itself, we do have things such as the national TOMs, the themes, outcomes and measures, the mechanism to hopefully come to a sensible approach and weighting around social value for that particular procurement exercise.
Yeah, definitely.
So do we want to take a little bit of time talking about in general the detail with regards to the contract management piece, and perhaps maybe take a deeper dive into KPI development and subsequent reporting? I know this is something that we covered in a recent podcast as well.
And contract management, Kieran, forgive me if I'm wrong, but contract management is going to get a lot more emphasis and focus, isn't it, in terms of the Procurement Act, and especially KPIs. This really is something new for the public sector authorities.
Undoubtedly, Fleur. Someone used a term at an event I attended a while back, which I liked, and they said, like, in particular, local authorities tend to let and forget their contracts, and that's very true. Back in the day, it would have been in a dusty drawer in a cabinet somewhere. Nowadays, it's probably on an Adobe sign or somewhere up in the cloud, but either way, it isn't always there when you ask for it. I know that much for sure. But anyway, I do think it's a good opportunity, on a serious note, to just consolidate better practice around contract management, because it's like anything. Ultimately, you're dealing with people, so if things aren't managed, then they aren't going to be as good as the outcomes would be if things were managed. And that applies, I think, in any context, but certainly with providers, I think, like, you do have to have a healthy level of contact with them, and sometimes that involves having a difficult conversation, but have the conversation, nip it in the bud early, before it becomes a bigger problem, and do try and have that collaboration, because ultimately these new rules, for example, on KPI setting, yes, it's going to look bad for a supplier if their scores aren't very good. It's not going to look good for your authority either if someone is looking at that and thinking, 100%, because it's going to lead to all sorts of questions.
Yeah. When it comes to the KPI development, and I know I've spoken to a lot of colleagues that work directly within the public sector, I think fear is the right word. I think there's a little bit of concern in terms of, ultimately who will create and take ownership of these KPIs. And, the line that I've fed back is that rather like the specification, I would suggest that actually the ownership doesn't necessarily land with the procurement function itself. It's the function department, the client, the customer of whom that procurement exercise is being undertaken on behalf of. I think I've picked up some initial, conversations from colleagues within the sector around that, and they are, they're a little bit perplexed in terms of who takes ownership of that, Kieran.
Well, it's a big change, isn't it? So obviously there's been KPIs in contracts, and contracts are being managed, and KPIs are being met and monitored and those type of things. But it's taking that extra step, isn't it? It's that extra layer now in terms of transparency, and we're actually going to have to publish this on an annual basis and sharing the information wider than just the procurement team or the and the client team, that type of thing. It's that sharing of the information, isn't it, Kieran? I think is probably where everyone's feeling a bit uneasy.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Fleur. For me, it's not the actual KPI imposition that's the bit that, and completely agree with Chris about people being a bit nervous, a bit anxious, a bit who does this sit with? But yeah, it's not the actual imposition of the KPIs. It's the fact you then have to go a step further and publish performance. And if performance is going well, great, but in the real world, things happen. Contracts are underperformed. Issues crop up. Sometimes, we've seen over the past few years things that none of us might have ever, envisaged. So there is certainly a bit of risk there, and it is very important to give careful thought to, setting your KPIs, setting them at the right level, and even would completely agree with Chris around, that the people who know the service drafting the KPIs, but for higher value contracts, in terms of the actual phraseology, like I would say this, but I would get legal colleagues involved as well, in terms of,
most definitely.
Because sometimes languages can be very subjective, and no language is more subjective than when different teams of lawyers are arguing over what it means. So people, we can all do ourselves a favor by just being crystal clear. And if, for example, what happens if, for example, there is a force majeure that might prevent a party meeting a KPI? What's going to happen then? The KPIs, there's obviously the publication, can be one of the outcomes, but, are there going to be other remedies, service credits, or possibly even termination? So it's not just a case, I would say, of setting the KPIs. Your contract terms need to coexist neatly with those KPIs in terms of what happens. What happens if a supplier doesn't meet the KPI, because that needs to be published to the market at the outset of the procurement, and therefore they can take a view, can we live with this, and are we going to bid, or are we not?
Definitely. I think two things I'll take away from that conversation we've just had there, in terms of the KPI development. Please, 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 no more boilerplate KPIs, no more one size fits all.
They're going to have to be tailored.
They are. So, following SMART objectives are the basic principle around the creation of the KPIs, and don't create a cottage industry out of doing those. And
don't make them too complicated. Don't have too many.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be really important. And I think one way I would suggest that would be a useful tool in which to identify in advance pre-procurement around the creation of suitable KPIs is as part of your market engagement. If you're doing a market sounding exercise, a pre-engagement exercise, liaising with the marketplace ahead of the formal commencement of that procurement exercise, and really get a feel for what is possible. Okay, granted, something to stretch the supplier and drive value, whether that be from a commercial or qualitative perspective. But I think, again, that further adds relevance and the importance of the KPIs to make sure that they are suitable for that particular procured subject matter.
Most definitely. It's going to be an interesting area to see.
Definitely. So I think the final thing we just wanted to talk about as a general approach is the contract documentation development. And I know, of course, this is a theme, Kieran, that's close to your heart, given your legal background, expertise, career to date, etc. What have your observations been around that in relation to what we've seen so far?
Yeah, well, I think it's really early days, Chris, and I'm not aware of any authorities, hopefully someone's listening that has, and all credit to them. But I think this is very much in the list of, oh yeah, gosh, we're going to need to do that as well. But, as you mentioned, it's really important that the contract terms are updated. I think in particular around KPIs, but also, some of the other new changes, like when a supplier becomes an excludable supplier mid-contract, or you may have references in your existing contracts to Regulation 72 or Regulation 73 around modifications, but that changes. So you're going to have to strip out any references to the current rules and replace it. And also maybe even to look at things like you've got your boilerplate clauses around freedom of information and things like that, but you could possibly cover the new sharing of information that we've spoken about, like your contract performance notices. Now, you don't need to, that the law requires you to publish them in certain circumstances. So I don't think you need a contractual right. What I would just say is, bear in mind the suppliers haven't sat through 10 hours of modules, haven't been to 3 hours of 3 days rather, 3 hours would be nice, of deep dive. So they're not, hopefully they listen to your podcast, but they're not going to be as close as the procurement professional world to these changes. I see absolutely no issues. Just flag up with them in your, invitation to tender and your contract documents what is required. And at least that way everybody goes into the relationship with their eyes wide open.
You know what, Kieran, as we were just talking there in terms of like different like terminology or wordings and those sort of things that might need to be changed in the T's and C's and things like that. It's almost like what they need to do now is a review of all their documentation, and almost like, so we need to go through like our template contract documents and be like, well, we need to update, I don't know, the terminology to the regulations, the different things in it, but then carry on throughout their whole suite of their procurement documents. And then they've got like an overview they can see all on, like, it wouldn't be on one page, but you know what I mean, like as an overview what needs to be done, and then we can work through that. It's almost like
amendments.
Sort of.
Yeah,
it's almost like a review needs to be taking place now. It's like, right, this is happening now, so what do we need to change, and going through it that way maybe.
Absolutely. And I think like one of the good things to do is it's very easy, it's very simple, but just make a list. What is it, if I can get the words out, at your authority that we need to change, and then kind of prioritize it and work through it. And like Chris raises a great point about KPIs. Absolutely include that in your pre-market engagement, but it's quite clear now that the Act has more detailed provisions around what pre-market engagement can be used for, and which I think is good, as a starting point. But it does also mention that you can, look at terms and conditions. I would absolutely encourage authorities to have those conversations, because we all know, and I'm sure we've seen it in the past, is you publish a contract, it ends up being very one-sided, and come the end of the process, you'll either have bidders trying to completely renegotiate it, which brings in the legal risk,
yes,
or on some of the portals when they can leave a message saying, why they didn't bid, it's all, unacceptable liability clauses or indemnities or whatever it is. So if someone's going to tell you, look, you're being completely unreasonable, it's best to know that before you're in the thick of the procurement process. So yeah, great point from Chris on the KPIs, and while we're there, throw in the contract terms and conditions, and maybe even a draft spec as well, and kind of get things in as good a state as possible before you publish. Because one of the other new notices we have amongst the 937 million other ones is you do have to publish a procurement termination notice. So if you abandon a procurement because, as I say, maybe it is just the terms and conditions are putting people off, or there are other things that's making this an unattractive procurement to the market, you do need to publish this new procurement termination notice where you abandoned. And again, it's not going to reflect well on the authority if someone goes on the portal and can see that you've this is the third time in a year that you've ran this procurement because you keep mucking it up. So get it right first time, and spend. I always say to people, don't be afraid to delay putting a tender out to make sure you've got it right in the first place.
Yeah, totally agree.
Hell of a lot.
We've covered a lot there in that discussions, haven't we?
Yeah. I think that's all we've got time for today. So again, Kieran, thank you so much for your time, your insightful contributions, and make sure that you check out Kieran's LinkedIn page, and we'll share that in all the necessary locations. Thank you, and for your continued take on all things related to the Act.
So just before we finish, make sure to check out our next procurement podcast episode, which will be a listener's choice following our poll and topics voted by you. So yeah, next one will be on routes to market. So make sure to join us for that one.